Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Coming up, China and Indonesia agreeing to work closer on multiple areas and boost military cooperation. Canada will hit the United States with retaliatory tariffs as their trade war escalates. The Russian share of India's oil imports surges to record high. Trump warns economic D-Day against Iran. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching for World Today. First up, China and Indonesia have agreed to deepen cooperation in areas including energy, mineral resources, artificial intelligence, and maritime affairs, and to begin formulating a 5-year action plan for 2027 to 2031. The two sides held a high-level 2+2 ministerial meeting in Jakarta, with Foreign Minister Wang Yi heading the Chinese delegation. Beijing and Jakarta also held their first conference of the China-Indonesia Comprehensive Strategic Dialogue Mechanism. And in a meeting with China's Foreign Minister and Defense Minister, Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto called for closer strategic cooperation with China. Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that China is willing to help Indonesia turn its resources into new drivers of economic development and accelerate industrialization and modernization. He also called for joint efforts to contribute to regional peace and stability. So for more, joining us now on the line is Han Hua, co-founder and Secretary General with Beijing Club for International Dialogue. So first of all, Han Hua, what do you think is the most important signal sent here by China and Indonesia pledging to deepen cooperation in multiple areas?
Yeah, for me, the dialogue happened about 3 to 4 days ago, and the 2+2 dialogue happened during the very first strategic dialogue between China and Indonesia. It is alongside 2+2 mechanism, so it makes it very unique. It's just not a normal and a regular 2+2 dialogue. So this time, I think both countries are giving this bilateral relationship a strategic depth through the continuous economic cooperation, more collaboration and coordination in security areas, giving the bilateral relations a more multilateral flavor, in my opinion. This is crucial to enhance the bilateral relations. And in addition to that, it is sending the signal to the process of shaping the new world order that China and Indonesia, both with these strategic positions in geopolitics, are keen to play more important roles and to assume more responsibilities, sometimes together, sometimes independently, in shaping the new world order. I think this is the most interesting and significant signal sending through this time's dialogue.
Okay. So China is actually the top buyer or one of the top buyers of Indonesia's resources like nickel, tin, copper, and palm oil, etc. When China says it is willing to help Indonesia turn its resources into new drivers of development, is it simply about buying more resources from Indonesia?
The more the better first. Yeah, we certainly need the resources, and we need to have more partner countries in terms of allocating and seeking and sourcing the resources. But certainly the bilateral relations between China and Indonesia is more than that. Because of the 2+2 and the in-depth of this year's 2+2 dialogue, we can see that China and Indonesia is entering into a new phase of collaboration, which means it enters into more sensitive areas, such as military cooperation. Beyond the dialogues, it enters into real actions. So it synchronizes the dialogues, messages, and activities together. So in terms of the economic trade and relations, I think it involves the whole value chain. It does not mean only you are the raw material provider and I'm the receiver of these raw materials, but instead they are going to build the factories together. They are going to utilize and engage the resources together in terms of the AI and the new technological innovation. So I think down the road, it means that China and Indonesia will have more trust. And through this mutual trust, China and Indonesia will have more collaboration to co-build the value chain together in terms of factories, technological transfer, more human resources collaboration, and also how to seek and pursue the world market together, and how to upgrade the raw materials into the next level product, which we can call it a new quality level of economic and trade cooperation.
So, how can the two sides properly manage their differences during this process of deepening their economic engagement?
I think for Indonesia, it is not just choosing China because it always upholds the free and active foreign policy, and it is actually hedging on China as well as other countries, which is totally understandable. From its tradition of the leader or one of the top advocates of the non-alignment movement back in the 1950s, 1960s through the Bandung Conference, and towards today's economic, military, and the political independence. I think it is totally understandable. And for China, it is also encourage or work with Indonesia and the countries in other ASEAN countries to uphold the independence as well as what we can call strategic autonomy, but also to encourage the setup of a strategic collaboration between China and ASEAN countries. So that down the road, I think the two sides can be more practical in terms of collaboration in many areas, such as the military, such as cooperation, such as foreign direct investment, economic and trade, to overcome the past difficulties and to draw lessons from the history and to encourage more people-to-people exchange and to encourage the areas into not only the strategic areas, but the technical areas in cooperation, such as to address the difficulties in trade imbalances, investment regulation, to enhance the local employment, to encourage the technology transfer, and to produce the environmental standards facing the joint ventures in Indonesia. And I think in addition to that, transparency remains another critical factor down the road. And both sides need clear rules and a level playing field for businesses, as we have also heard about the complaints from the Chinese investors as well. And also respect two countries' development priorities and find the overlaps. I think these are the crucial factors that can be addressed and tackled by two sides.
You have already touched upon the cooperation between China and Indonesia's militaries. So further into that, how does its prospect or outlook look like? I mean, this area seems to be more sensitive than, say, economic and trade cooperation, but when it does happen, it will somehow attract more attention from, say, third-party observers.
Yeah, security concern is one of the top concerns in terms of today's geopolitical and the geoeconomic development. So the security cooperation between China and one of the largest countries in the world, Indonesia, is very significant, and it is not significant in bilateral relations. It also bears the significance in terms of the multilateral development. And I'm happy that this time the dialogue has moved from the sending oral messages toward very significant activities such as capability building, as they mentioned in their joint declaration. In Chinese words, as I said, it synchronizes the dialogue with actions down the road. And from what I read from the news report, the two sides agreed to increase military exercises, officer exchanges, and other defense activities together. And according to the Indonesia side, they said that the two sides even discussed about establishing a joint munitions factory in Indonesia, potentially involving Chinese technology transfer. And I think this is a very good upgrade of defense cooperation. Highly sensitive, much more closer. It signifies that there are more trust and the mutually reliable resources are building and are allocated together. And I think also this time, defense is not only about defense per se, it is being linked to economic and technological cooperation as well. The agenda by Foreign Minister Wang Yi and also its defense minister, his counterpart in Indonesia, the defense minister, the foreign minister, especially the Indonesia side has claimed again and again that the agenda already extended well beyond the traditional security, involves critical minerals, energy, AI cooperation, even including satellites, green energy, railways, and fisheries. They are all discussed in this defense and the 2+2 dialogue. I think this also suggests that the relationship is increasingly being conceived in terms of development, security coordination, or as in Chinese terms. It is discussed in the frame of the 4 global initiatives, which has the global security initiatives and global development securities are closely connected, which is a very unique signal sent by the two sides.
We understand China has established the 2+2 dialogue mechanism with several ASEAN countries already, including Indonesia. Will they serve as the model for similar arrangements between more ASEAN countries and China?
I think I'm an advocate on that. I think the 2+2 mechanism is a very ambitious and very, very creative method. It has the potential to become a broader platform for China and ASEAN countries in security cooperation. But having said this, I would like to suggest that it should not be treated or conducted as a one-size-fits-all model. ASEAN countries have very different strategic circumstances, and they have their very different development and security agenda. So we should utilize this 2+ model, but we should tailor-made it into different countries. So it is still able to bring foreign policy and the defense officials together to discuss security while keeping the broader relationship focused on development and economic cooperation, and even people-to-people exchange. But also, it can encourage still the ASEAN countries to develop at its own pace, at its own agenda, but bear in mind that it is closely related to the foreign policy and to the military cooperation.
Thank you very much for joining us. Han Hua, co-founder and Secretary General with the Beijing Club for International Dialogue. You are listening to World Today. Stay tuned. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. China's trade surplus has once again become a source of debate, with some Western voices warning that surging Chinese exports are putting pressure on other economies. But China's role in global trade is not just about what China sells, it is also about what it buys. China's imports rose by 22% year-on-year from January to July this year, with monthly import growth outpacing export growth for 5 consecutive months. This is highlighting the scale of China's demand for goods from across the world. So, Is China's trade strength really creating a so-called squeeze on other economies, or is it helping reshape global supply chains and it creates new opportunities for trading partners? For more on this, my colleague Zhao Yang earlier spoke with Dr. Li Luan, Assistant Professor of Economics with Peking University.
So, Professor Li Luan, recently some Western voices have revived the narrative of surging Chinese exports, and they claimed that China's trade surplus is creating a so-called squeeze or shock for other economies. So, how do you view this?
Yeah, so from the data, China does have a surplus. So according to the WTO data, our merchandise sales and also the trade surplus is well above $1 trillion every year. But I do think, a large surplus by itself is not a direct evidence that China is squeezing or giving a shock to the industrialization of the rest of the world. So I think, to answer that question, a lot of experts are asking, in fact, a counterfactual question that if China has developed or grows differently, how would the other countries might have behaved? So I think that's a much harder question. So I think China's comparative advantage does not benefit from, for example, low wages alone. It doesn't directly benefit, it benefited from the low wages and also opening up and joining the WTO and so on and so forth. But these factors alone cannot explain China's growth. So I think, for example, China's supply chain, the domestic competition, automation, spillover of knowledge, our education system, I think they all kind of contribute to this, high level and advanced manufacturing growth. So I think, by simply saying, with some countries or industries, they're facing the competition from China and extending that argument to say China is responsible for other countries' failure to industrialize. I think that proposition or that conclusion is a bit of a stretch and do require a lot stronger evidence. Honestly, personally, I don't think they have any solid foundation behind.
Mm-hmm. And international trade is the result of independent business decisions made by companies around the world. So there is no forced buying or selling in international markets. And China's exports have remained strong, but imports growing even faster than exports. So tell us the details of China's imports. What does it tell us about the real health of China's foreign trade?
So yes, in the first half of 2026, we're seeing that the imports have reached 10.74 trillion yuan, which is a 22.1% increase, versus the export growth is, have a 13.4% growth. So that means, as you said, import growth have exceeded export growth by over, 8 percentage points. And also, if you look at the composition, it's even more informative. So for example, China imported about 1.43 billion tons of major commodities, such as energy products, metal ores, and which is 3.4% increase in volume. And if we look at agricultural imports, it has risen by 8.62%. And also, I think the most interesting number is in terms of machinery and electrical products. So import in this category has increased by 28%. So this tells us that China's trade is, embedded in the global supply chain, the global production network. So the Chinese manufacturers, they are both exporters, but also, importers or purchasers of components of machineries, electronics, and other production inputs from abroad. So I think, so overall, I think that the assessment of China's trade should definitely look beyond our surplus. So, we need to look at what's being imported, what's being exported, and how China is really connected to the multinational production network. So right now, from the import number, we're actually seeing China is doing a very important and actually taking an integral part in the global supply chain.
And China is the world's second largest import market. So to what extent is China's import demand creating opportunities for businesses in other countries?
Yes, so the scale, as you mentioned, is really creating a lot of substantial opportunities. So China's import, for example, from Southeast Asian agriculture is one of the example. So China has imported 1.87 million tons of fresh durian, for example, in 2025. So that durian market is is bringing a lot of opportunities to suppliers in Vietnam, Malaysia, Laos, and also Thailand. So Africa is also a very important example. For example, China is the largest export destination for African developing economies. So basically, China has purchased over 80 billion of merchandise every year. So I think, the opportunities is also not limited just to poor economies. China also import sophisticated machinery, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, consumer brands from advanced economies as well. So I think its role in the world trade is not just as a competitor, it's also a customer or consumer, and as well as a production partner. So I think these three roles are kind of closely integrated, and it is very hard to separate from each other.
And China's exports have been strong. So what does it tell us about China's role in the global supply chain?
Yeah, so I think the key message, as we have discussed, is that China is no longer just the final assembly point of the global supply chain. It has increasingly become an essential supplier of both the industrial inputs, the components, and also the production technology as well. So I think, for example, we are seeing a rise in both the import and export of a lot of intermediate goods. So a lot of, for example, when some analysts are analyzing why China's EV industry have developed so fast, a lot of them mention that China has actually developed a very mature supply chain for auto parts. So by providing these intermediate goods, so China is increasing its role, or developing its role, not just a factory or an assembly point, but more like a hub for the supply chain. So if you want the final product, China can produce it, but if you want the intermediate product, China can also happily provide it. So I think this is a very important distinction from the role that China took before.
And as you mentioned, China is exporting higher value products from EVs and batteries to AI-related products. So how do you understand China's innovation dividends to the world? And in your understanding, is there such a thing as China Shock 2.0, or is that the China Opportunity 2.0?
In the China's case, if we look at China's composition of our export growth, the fastest growing areas are the areas that you mentioned, for example, in industrial robots, in 3D printers, in lithium batteries, and also, semiconductors. So I think the innovation dividend, as you mentioned, is coming directly through the lower technology cost. For example, if you have a cheaper supplier of batteries, it's going to lower the cost of your local EV production. It's going to lower the cost of if you use it for not EV, but for robots, for energy storage in general, it's going to lower the cost. And if you have a more affordable industrial robot, it's going to lower the threshold of factory automation, no matter where you are. If you have more inexpensive machinery, it's going to allow a developing country the manufacturing in a developing country to kind of enter production with less capital. So I think the effect of Chinese innovation is not measured by how many Chinese products are actually sold in the local product market and competing with their foreign products. We can also ask how much Chinese technology is changing the cost structure of producers elsewhere. And this is especially going to be pronounced in the age of AI boom. For example, China is also providing a lot of AI models through our low-cost infrastructure, low-cost manufacturing base. So I think overall, if we have to choose between the two extremes, I would definitely say that China Opportunity 2.0 is going to better capture the potential of when countries use the cheaper technology, use the more advanced technology brought by Chinese investment, it's going to increase the productivity and the effectiveness of their local manufacturing as well.
Dr. Li Lun, Assistant Professor of Economics with Peking University, talking with my colleague Zhao Yang. More to come. Canada will hit the United States with retaliatory tariffs as trade war escalates. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Heng in Beijing. We'll be back after a short break. You're back with World Today. I'm Dinghan in Beijing. Canada has announced the retaliatory tariffs on the United States after Washington imposed a 50% levy on 20 billion US dollars worth of Canadian goods. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says the new Canadian tariffs are going to target U.S. steel, dairy, and electronics industries, among others. The announcement came after days of intense negotiations broke down, worsening the relationship between the longtime trade partners and allies. Washington's new tariffs hit sectors including wine, furniture, dairy products, cement, clothing, and hockey equipment. They cover 5.5% of Canada's exports to the United States. So for more, joining us now on the line is Andy Mauck, author of the book The Innovation Machine, as well as a professor joining us from Beijing Foreign Studies University. Thank you very much for joining us, Andy.
My pleasure, Ding Hong.
So Canada says its trade talks with the United States broke down because Washington had set conditions that were ultimately unacceptable. Those demands included curtailing Canada's ability to forge new trade deals with other economies, for example. And according to Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, U.S. negotiators also made threats to the French language and the culture in the Canadian province of Quebec. So why do you think those conditions set by the United States unacceptable to Canada?
Well, Ding Hong, I think you did a great job of laying out the details. But I think we can really sum it up that this is a direct attack on Canada's sovereignty, right? So every country, has the right to choose its trade partners, choose what language it prioritizes, elements of its culture. And here, I think the way it was viewed by Canada is that these U.S. Demands or requirements were a violation of that sovereignty. And I think that's what made it very difficult for Canada to accept these terms. And again, the reporting is not completely clear, whether this was last minute or these were things they were negotiating all along. But, I think ultimately it comes down to a question of sovereignty.
Okay. Public opinion surveys in Canada show most Canadians support a tougher approach to the United States in the trade talks. For example, a poll conducted last week showed 56% of Canadians favored a hard line and making no more concessions. Is that an understandable sentiment in Canada?
Ding Hung, I think it is, right? Because, I think there are legitimate trade issues between Canada and the United States, just as there are between any countries, that can and should be resolved through negotiation. But at the same time, I think, the Canadian public and probably the American public as well see this also as a sort of power play or the U.S. Throwing its weight around. Because if we look at Canada, it's the 11th largest economy in the world, 40 million population. So it sounds, pretty impressive in absolute terms. But when you compare it to the United States, it's much, much smaller. So, the U.S. has an economy about 13 times the size of Canada and obviously a much, much larger population as well. But also, when we look at it from a trade perspective, because this is what we're talking about, this trade war or this conflict, in that Canada is very, very exposed to the U.S. market, whereas the U.S. I think exports to Canada are something like 1%. So this creates a power asymmetry, which I think this administration, the U.S. administration, well recognizes, and is using this for either to deliberately show it can bully Canada, or to use a Chinese phrase, kill the chicken to scare the monkeys, in that, to take this very aggressive approach to Canada in the hope that it will buy acquiescence from other countries are allies around the world. So I think, when we look at it that way, it's not surprising at all that, Canadian public sentiment is what it is.
So, how many cards does Canada hold in terms of retaliating against the President Donald Trump's duties?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Ding Hung. So, exports, I mentioned that, there's this enormous asymmetry.
Yeah.
Canadian exports to the US are about 17% of their GDP and account for about 2.6 million jobs. It's a pretty big number. So on the other hand, as I mentioned, the US, it's only about 1%. So this means that, from that more narrow perspective, Canada may have fewer cards to play. Some people talk about the escalation or the nuclear option is energy. Could Canada perhaps even embargo or stop sending oil to the United States? I think something like 3.6 million barrels a day out of about 4-ish million total go to the United States. And could that be a card? Maybe, maybe not. But again, at the same time, if Mark Carney is correct that Canada is settling in for a long-term change in the structure of the relationship between Canada and the United States, I think they will have no choice but to rebalance significantly, even though that would create some short-term pain and dislocation.
Carney is framing the trade war with the U.S. as an opportunity for Canada to strengthen its trade relationship with other countries. Realistically, how much advance, how much progress can Ottawa expect in that direction, Andy? Given the fact that, like you mentioned earlier, Canada has long been depending on the United States for, I guess, more than 70% of the country's exports.
Yeah, so Ding Hong, that's a great question. And again, I would say that, we have to look at it in the short run and in the long run. So in the short run, again, it is what it is. And, if we look at oil as an example, these are delivered via pipelines. And I don't think, that Canada, the country, actually controls the oil tap, right? But at the same time, if we look at it in the long run, countries have faced political disasters, natural disasters, and have found a way to adapt. So I think the big question is, how long does this last? Like, will it go beyond the midterms? Will it go beyond the end of the Trump administration? And how does this play out? But, human ingenuity being what it is, I think if it's necessary, Canada or, any country can adapt to more adverse structural circumstances.
In a bigger picture sense, Andy, do you think the relationship between the U.S. and Canada will go back to its good old days, let's put it that way, when President Trump is gone from office?
Yeah, so, again, that's a great question, Ding Hung. So on the one hand, people can change, policies can change, but also the world is changing as well, right? So
Yeah.
the world where, Canada and the US were very, very close, I don't think that world exists anymore. So what that means is there's many more opportunities for Canadian exports or bilateral trade or inbound investment, et cetera. So, given that, it seems more unlikely that it could go back to the way it was. And also, even though politicians can change, I think people can still do, or leaders can still do lasting damage to relationships that far outlive their tenure. So, but again, this is all just speculation, and we will have to see what happens.
Let's indeed keep an eye on what's going to happen. But thank you very much for joining us. Andy Mauck, author of the book, The Innovation Machine, and professor with Beijing Foreign Studies University. Coming up, the Russian share of India's oil imports surges to record high. This is World Today. We'll be back.
Hello, I am Dr. Digby James Wren, a political analyst and international relations scholar specializing in China area studies. World Today offers unmatched in-depth perspectives on China's politics, economics, business, technology and society. World Today's team of reporters and contributors provides valuable information from all of the world's major economies. I hope you can join me on World Today for the very best insights and news from China, on China, and help to build a better understanding of China's role in the world today.
You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. India's purchases of Russian oil has reached a record high despite tighter Western sanctions. Data from analytical firm Kepler shows that India imported about 5 million barrels of crude oil per day in June and July. Of that total, roughly 2.6 million barrels a day came from Russia, accounting for more than half of the country's crude oil imports. That was marking the highest level since the United States and Israel launched a joint military action against Iran in late February. So for more, my colleague Xu Yawen spoke with Gao Xirui, a PhD candidate in political science with the University of Hong Kong.
Xirui, so India's imports of Russian oil have reached a record high, with Russian crude accounting for more than half of the country's oil imports over the past 2 months. What's driving this surge? Is this mainly an economic decision or a strategic one amid global energy uncertainty?
This is a very good question. So I think it's both. So one reason could be strategic and the other is economic. So strategically, the tensions in the Strait of Hormuz obviously would drive India to buy Russian oil in lieu of, in compensation of LNG and other LPG oil products that transit from the Strait of Hormuz, because the domestic demand in India is huge and they cannot wait a single day. So they have to increase their purchase from the Russian oil to fill the gap. Also economically, given that the tension in Strait of Hormuz and you have to pay extra to ship oil from there, so it would be rather more economic to buy the lower priced Russian oil, and it would be very a smart choice. So I would believe that both strategic reason and economic reason drive India to make this decision.
As you said, the conflict in the Middle East and disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz have pushed India toward greater reliance on Russian oil. And in the meantime, we know that New Delhi depends heavily on overseas energy supplies, importing more than 90% of its crude oil and about half of its natural gas demand. So how vulnerable is India's energy security to instability in the Middle East?
I think it would be quite vulnerable, to be honest. According to Prime Minister Modi's latest speech, that India imports 90% of its energy and roughly 85% to 88% of its total crude oil. Historically, about 40% to 50% of these crude imports, that's roughly 2.5 million barrels per day, transit through the Strait of Hormuz from the Middle Eastern suppliers like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. So that's why the India energy security is especially vulnerable during the Middle East tension. And India also relies on this choke point for about 60% of its natural gas and roughly 90% of its liquefied petroleum gas or LPG imports. These two kind of energy are especially important to India because, India have a very huge population and they have a very large rural population where you have very limited natural gas coverage, and they have to rely on LPG for cooking and other basic demands. So that's why India also have to import a lot of LPG to satisfy both civilian needs and other, demands of its industries. And what's more, it will also affect India's capability to generate electricity, and the heat wave is driving up the demand for electricity. So overall, India would be especially vulnerable in terms of energy security.
Let's look at how would this affect India and the U.S. relations, because we know the country has maintained close ties with both Washington and Moscow. So could this recent sharp increase in Russian oil imports create tensions between New Delhi and Washington? And how does India balance its partnership with U.S. while maintaining energy cooperation with Russia?
It's quite intuitive to say that buying Russian oil would make Washington unhappy, and that's quite true. If we look at India's bargaining with U.S. in terms of the trade a few months ago, it was definitely factored that created tensions between the U.S.-India relations. However, I think there might be two nuances that India could leverage. The first is that the U.S. temporary sanction waivers, meaning the U.S. issued exemption to India, says that, okay, it's okay for you to import Russian oil, but that ends during mid-May 2026. So the Indian side may think that if you issue once, maybe you will issue twice in the future. So the one nuance is that maybe India expects another exemption in the short future, so it's okay to buy Russian oils. The second issue is that India Petroleum Ministry representatives stressed that the purchases from Russian oil occurred before, during, and after temporary waivers based on market needs, and they will be purchased Russian oils independently, so that they may think that on this stage they have finalized with their treaty on their trade with U.S., and they have finished all the substantive contents and just polishing the text. So the Indian side may expect that the U.S. is very unlikely to revoke the whole treaty at this stage, just because India is buying more Russian oils and build a new one from scratch, or just start the whole bargaining from scratch. And probably India think that it would be unreliable. That would be probably not the case. So I think probably these are the two nuances that India could leverage to balance its partnership with the U.S. and Russia.
And Siri, another thing is that the Modi government has pledged to expand renewable energy and diversify the country's energy sources. Then how realistic is it for India to reduce its dependence on imported oil and achieve its ambitious clean energy targets, such as the country is hoping to achieve the 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity by 2030 and net zero carbon emissions by 2070. So can India achieve that target while maintaining economic growth?
I think if in the long term, I think probably India would achieve energy security while maintaining good economic growth. And I appreciate this ambitious plan. But if we look at the ground and look at some data, I think first India would have to face a lot of obstacles. We just mentioned about the rural population. If we want to do that, they have to invest a lot in clean energy, especially in the vast rural area. They have to invest more in solar panels, in hydropower, etc., instead of coals, which is most ubiquitous among Indian rural countryside and rural areas. And another issue is that they have to import more, clean energy devices, especially from China. Means that they have to, readjust their strategies and their ties with China. That means that they have to give up to a certain extent that to cultivate their own industry, but instead to buy more and import more new energy devices and strategies from China to facilitate this process.
That was Gao Xirui, a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Hong Kong, speaking with my colleague Xu Yawen. Coming up, Trump warns of economic D-Day against Iran. This is World Today. Stay tuned.
Hello, I'm Yin Liang, Kramer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. In a rapidly changing world, staying informed has never been more important. World Today delivers sharp analysis, global perspectives, and the stories behind the headlines. It is your trusted source to understand what's shaping our world. World Today, bringing the world closer.
You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. A senior Iranian official has warned that Tehran will consider any state's participation in the U.S. anti-Iran economic operation as an act of war. Mohsen Rezai, Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, spoke in response to recent comments made by U.S. President Donald Trump. President Trump announced that the United States will be imposing an unprecedented level of economic warfare and isolation on Iran. In the meantime, Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority has announced that vessels that violate Iran's protocols for transiting in the Strait of Hormuz will face restrictions on their future passages. So for more, joining us now on the line is Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Fudan University. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So first of all, Dr. Zhang, what do you think has really prompted President Donald Trump to tout a campaign of economic or financial pressure against Tehran? What kind of reality facing Trump do you think this is shedding light on?
Right. Actually, I think the shift toward high economic pressure against Tehran, as you said, shows the operational constraints and a lot of challenges facing the Trump administration at the moment. Well, we see that months of intense air operations have destroyed critical infrastructure, but actually military force alone has failed to compel Tehran's major compromise. And also the United States has faced to force Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz on its terms. So now there is growing frustration within the United States with a war that has lasted nearly 6 months without a decisive outcome. And this actually sheds light on several realities facing the Trump administration. On the one hand, it shows the limits of imposing pressure on a resilient adversary with experience surviving the case of sanctions. And on the other hand, Trump also faces domestic political impacts, such as prolonged conflict carries rising costs, also public fatigue and electoral risks.
Some argue that the current combination of military strikes, a naval blockade, and regional trade suspension, for example, conducted by the UAE, creates a storm for Tehran that never existed before. But conversely, some are warning that this will only harden Tehran's position. Which analysis is more accurate in your to you?
My observation is that both scenarios are occurring at the same time. We can say indeed Iran's economy is already under extreme strain. Oil exports have been disrupted, and also severe inflation is stretching state resources to historic extremes. However, this is not the first time that Iran has faced economic restrictions from the United States. Actually, over the past decades, Iran has developed the tactic of resistance economy in the face of sanctions imposed by the United States. So at this point, while the material pressure represents a severe crisis, history shows that it is far more likely to harden Iran's asymmetric retaliation. And now, against the backdrop of continued tensions between the United States and Iran, escalating economic sanctions against Iran might, in the end, provoke a more intense determination to resist.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has mentioned targeting nations doing businesses with Iran. I mean, some of those nations include U.S. partners or U.S. allies even, and some are vital economies in today's world. So how likely will Washington do that, and what will be the economic fallout for the United States in the case of a scenario like that?
Well, this is possible. Actually, Washington will likely deploy targeted secondary sanctions against intermediary shipping networks, regional front companies, and smaller regional financial institutions in order to further impose further pressure against Iran. But it might face a number of risks because threatening you are either with us or against us strains its ties with its partners, especially those dependent on regional supply chains. And at the same time, we know that strictly cutting off all remaining Iranian crude oil could create immediate blowback for the United States domestic economy itself, because with fewer barrels on the market, then global oil prices could also jump quickly. And this will drive up shipping and production costs, lead directly to higher gasoline prices for American consumers.
So basically what we are seeing right now is that Trump is shifting to a maximum economic and a financial war or pressure against Tehran, and at the moment Tehran seems to be holding steady or holding firm, and like you said, this scenario is actually pretty familiar to Tehran. So going forward, what could be the immediate next stage in this Iran war, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's very hard to say. And right now, things are becoming increasingly worrisome. Right now, Tehran's tighter control over the Strait of Hormuz, along with its warning and discourse that not a single drop of oil will be exported, these actually suggest that Iran may step up its actions at sea, and this could mean further blockade movement or boarding operations. And also at the same time, regional tensions are likely to spike even further, because if severe economic sanctions cut off Tehran's main source of money, then Iran might also feel that it has little left to lose. So in response, it could call on its regional allies to demonstrate their strike capabilities against United States logistical hubs and regional energy facilities. And also it's very important to note that right now, there is not just the United States and Iran, but also we are seeing that there is an increasing tension between Saudi Arabia and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Finally, high-stake diplomacy could also return to prevent a complete collapse. So it means that maybe the mediators might also want to push forward for renewed negotiations to avert a unmanageable regional closure of the Hormuz.
Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Zhang Chuchu joining us from Fudan University. That's all the time for this edition of the program. I'm Ding Han in Beijing. Bye for now.